Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Carrie Cisna, and I am on the board at the Interfaith Center at Miami University. And I'd like to welcome you all and thank you so much for being here to share this time with us. We're so grateful for you sharing your space with us. We know you have a limited time schedule, and we're excited that you want to learn more about interfaith work, which is what we're interested in as well. Tonight, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Barton, who is the director for the Center for Faith and Learning at Pepperdine University, which is in Malibu, California. Him and his wife have a very interesting story, though. They haven't always been in Malibu. They spent some time in Africa, and he's a social activist. I do want to mention he teaches in the undergraduate philosophy and religion department. He also teaches at the graduate level in their dispute resolution program at the law school, which is one of the top programs in the nation. He also teaches in social entrepreneurship at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology. So he's a professor, but also it seems like a jack of all trades, passionate about a lot of things that have to do with changing the world, has spent time in Uganda, getting your PhD. And so we're so excited to hear about your new book, which is called Better Religion, a Primer for Interreligious Peacebuilding, because that is what we're really interested in doing at the Interfaith Center at Miami University. But we just want to learn from you, like, where did this book come from? Tell us more about your journey, Dr. Barton. And then if we have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat box or wait until the end, and we'll do some Q&A for the last portion of this session. So thanks, everyone. And Dr. Barton, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for Dr. Cisna for that introduction. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this. I've enjoyed getting to learn a little bit more about the Interfaith Center there at Miami University, and am honored to be a part of this program and to share a little bit about my book. I will say that I'm really inspired by the center, just reading the website and the whole idea or the emphasis on bringing people together for dialogue and education. And especially I appreciate the addition of collaboration for social change being a part of that, because that's very close to my heart. And as I'll be sharing a little bit here for the next few minutes, I live with the conviction that in the interfaith world, in the interreligious world, we need more than mere toleration or coexistence. We need collaboration for building together a better world and caring about peace and justice and the things that the religious traditions around the world care about. And so anyway, so thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here and be a part of this. And I think more of my story will come out as I talk a little bit about my book. The only thing that I will add to what Dr. Cisna said is that in some ways, as I wrote this book, and she asked me if I was going to use any technology or share my screen. I told her I'm low tech, so I just hold up my book. So here it is. It's not even focused, I think. But anyway, so my book is Better Religion. It's an introduction to interreligious peacebuilding. And while I wrote it for classes that I teach, programs that I teach in, students that I have, a few that are linked in right now, some of my former students. I also wrote it for civic leaders and for people in the teaching and helping professions, professionals that are out there whose work finds themselves at the intersections of religious diversity, hoping that this book can be a tool for people that want to think deeply about interfaith peacebuilding, and want to be not just inspired, but be equipped for more interreligious collaborations for peace and for justice. But I'll also say that I also wrote the book, and I say this in the preface, I also wrote it, I say, for an audience of one, and that is, I kind of wrote it for myself. This book is a working out of some ideas and some things that I've been working on, some activities and some interreligious work that I've been doing myself for the last 30 years on different continents and different contexts. And so this book is an attempt for me to kind of put my ideas out there, to test them, to put them out there for evaluation and for assessment, to be, I hope to be considered by anyone that cares about interreligious peace, but also to be challenged and to start conversations and discussions around these topics. I do write as a religious person myself. I'm a practicing Christian. And while I don't write this book just for a Christian audience, I write it for a wider audience, so a wider interreligious community that I'm a part of. I do write it from personal convictions that Jesus calls me and calls Christians to be peacemakers. And so I'm trying to work that out, both in myself and in my work as well. So with that said, I think as I will plan, as I've been invited to do here, I will share a little bit about the book and what I try to do in the book for maybe 20 or 30 minutes here, and then we'll open it up for some questions. As Carrie said, you can be putting your questions in the chat box as we go here. But let me start like this. My book, Better Religion, draws on a conviction that I have that interreligious peace building has never been more important than it is right now. That the 21st century is a time when interreligious and interfaith activism is especially important. And so it's one of the reasons why I appreciate the work of the Interfaith Center and other efforts like this. While certainly human religion and human spirituality, human religiosity is changing across the world in some really remarkable ways, religion continues to be a powerful force in the world. And the interactions between religious people and religious communities, I think we increasingly see evidence that interreligious activities and interreligious interactions are going to have a major impact on how the 21st century turns out, for better or for worse. And one of the things that I say in my book is that the jury is still out on this. This is not just a feel-good book about religious people holding hands and doing good things. This is a book that is laced with a certain amount of urgency, an urgency that says religion is going to impact our world increasingly so as the century moves on, and that impact can be positive or negative. And so the title of the book, Better Religion, when we talk about how religion can impact the world for better or for worse, I wrote this book to try to explore and promote the idea of religion's better impact. And so better religion, something that I'm pursuing here. I'm sure many of you, anyone that's interested in interfaith work knows the name Eboo Patel. And Eboo at Interfaith America talks about how religions in the 21st century, to use his language, his memorable language, religion can be a bubble of isolation, a bomb of destruction, or a bridge of cooperation. And that's kind of a memorable way of thinking about the impact that religion will have and can have in the 21st century. And the fact is, religion and religions will be all of those things in the 21st century. It will be a bubble that people retreat into. It will continue to be a bomb that people throw in violence and in aggression. But religion can also be a very powerful set of tools for bridge building and for cooperation. And so, again, the title of the book, Better Religion, is aspirational. It's a call for all of us from our different religious traditions to identify and lean into the better angels of our different traditions for the sake of, as I say at the beginning of the book, for the sake of the world that we want our grandchildren to inherit, with the conviction that religion has the power to do that. And so part of what I offer is that the world doesn't need less religion, the world needs better religion, and how we can imagine that and how we can lean into that. And so with this book, I try to imagine what interreligious peace building can look like. My book is not a how-to manual. I don't offer like the 5 steps to interreligious peace building or, the 7 habits of highly effective peace builders. Those kind of books would be good, and people have written those books. But this book, I'm a philosopher by training. This book is a conceptual book. And so I build on this idea that we got to picture what we want to pursue. And if we want to pursue interreligious peace building, we have to be able to imagine what interreligious peace building is, how it operates. We have to be able to picture how it would work in the world. And so I try to offer a toolbox or a toolkit of resources, of conceptual resources that helps us know what's going on in the world religiously and imagine and pursue interreligious peace building. So I define terms, I assess different theories, I do data analysis, I interpret historical events. I do all kinds of things in this book to try to offer us a toolkit of resources for understanding and pursuing interreligious peace building. So with that somewhat wordy introduction, what I would like to do with the few remaining minutes that I'm going to speak is to give you, to highlight 2 claims that I make in the book, to offer 1 metaphor, and then to offer 1 historical example. And I'll do each of these pretty quickly, but 2 claims, 1 metaphor, and 1 historical example. And then I'll see what discussions or questions people have. So the 2 claims, I make more than 2, but the 2 claims I want to highlight in the book about interreligious peace building are the following. The first claim is that interreligious peace building at its most effective is something that happens at a local grassroots level. And so I really emphasize grassroots, local peace building. And my point there, that the point of that claim is that interreligious peace building is not primarily something that happens from in a top-down way. It's not something that is primarily done by elite institutional leaders or through political policies, and then it kind of trickles down to the rest of us. I do believe there's very important work to be done by institutional leaders, and I do believe that there are policies that we need to pursue and that are very important, having to do with political freedoms, for example, and religious freedom. But the point of my book is that the most effective form of interreligious peace building is something that actually works from the bottom up. It's something that bubbles up. It's something you might think of this if you're familiar with the language of sustainable development. It's that peace building, interreligious peace building, is something that starts at the asset level, local assets and local resources through ordinary people, and then it bubbles up from there. So that's 1 claim that I make, and that claim draws on a lot of theory. I'll just highlight the political scientists, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan. They wrote a book, a very important book, a number of years ago called Why Civil Resistance Works. It's Columbia University, 2015, I think, or 14. But what they highlight, and they do a long study, empirical study of civil resistance. And what they highlight is that it only takes a very small percentage of a population, even less than 5%, a very small percentage of a population that is committed to grassroots peacemaking to have large-scale impacts. In fact, they say 3.5 to 5% of a population that works at local grassroots peacemaking efforts will have 2 times the effect for large-scale changes in a society that military efforts will have, or that elite political actors can have. And so that I take that to be good news, but it's also that conviction that interreligious peace building is best thought of as a local grassroots at that level. And so that's my first claim, and I could say more about that, but I'll leave it at that. The second claim that I make in the book, or a second claim that I make, is that for interreligious peace building to be most effective, it has to honor and to engage our religious differences. and those things that are incompatible sometimes between different religions, convictions we have, beliefs we have, practices we have that are sometimes even irreconcilable. That we have to engage and directly address those differences and not just push them under the rug. This leans into, for those of you that are familiar with Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, it leans into what he called the dignity of our differences, honoring and offering the dignity of different religions to be different from one another, and to not to always think that we have to homogenize or melt together the religious differences so that we can respect one another or get along. And so, again, my conviction here is that interreligious peace building doesn't need to marginalize our differences. It needs to engage them directly. And sometimes that's a messy process. Sometimes it's a difficult process, but it's important for interreligious peace building. And what I do there is I really, in this book, I challenge what is sometimes still a common assumption in peace studies. And that common assumption is that religious differences or religious exclusivisms inevitably lead to hostility, that religious differences are a barrier to peace. I challenge that. Now, religious differences and exclusivism sometimes, and more often than I would like, are a barrier to peace and do lead to hostility, but that is not inevitably so. And in fact, I think that is a very important point for us to take into consideration. Another way of saying that, this is kind of a different way of saying the same thing, is that we don't necessarily have to establish common ground in order to build peace between religious communities. Sometimes that's a mantra that's used is let's marginalize our differences, let's just focus on what we have in common, and then we'll have kind of the platform to stand on to build peace. I understand that logic, and I'm not totally opposed to that logic. So I try to nuance it. I'm not trying to oppose that. But I do want to at least challenge it and at least say that focusing on what different religions have in common as a means toward peace building is only part of the answer. And sometimes I would even offer that that when we focus on commonalities first, that we are working in a way that is backwards from what is most effective. And that we need to first honor the dignity of our differences. We can have common concerns even when we don't share common ground religiously, but we can lean into our differences in ways that actually lead to interreligious peace building. So those are some big convictions. So those are the two claims that I said. One is that interreligious peace building is most effective at the grassroots level, and second, interreligious peace building has to engage and honor religious differences. And so from there, what I'll do is share one metaphor that I use in the book, and then one historical example, and then I'll bring my part to a close. And so here's the metaphor. The major metaphor of my book is the metaphor of a bridge. And this is a very simple metaphor. We talk about bridge building, we talk about peace building, and so I just try to explore and kind of illustrate that metaphor and its simplicity. And so here's how I do that. I use the metaphor of a bridge for interreligious peace building in the following way. I ask, what is a bridge? Just a physical bridge. Well, a bridge is something that stretches over an otherwise impassable chasm. That there's some chasm that we cannot cross, and so a bridge is built in order to make that impassable chasm passable. And the impassable chasm may be created by a river or a ravine or a highway that you can't cross. Whatever it is, a bridge crosses it, but how does it do so? A bridge does so by connecting opposite sides, right? And that's important. A bridge will connect opposite sides by virtue of two separate foundations that are built on opposite shores. That's what makes it possible. These separate foundations It's not common ground in that sense. You have opposite shores, and you have a ravine or a river in between that can't otherwise be crossed. And so separate foundations built on separate shores with their own internal integrity make it possible then for the girders and the beams to stretch across the impassable chasm and connect them. And so I'm trying to imagine something analogous for interreligious peace building, that rather than talk about just what we have in common in our different religions, we can even start by talking about how we exist on opposite, sometimes different religious shores. And that on our different religious shores, our different traditions have independent resources, independent foundations that make it possible for us to build toward one another. And I find that to be a very helpful way of thinking about this. Our different theological foundations on different religious shores, sometimes those foundations are even incompatible with one another. Sometimes they're compatible and sometimes there are overlaps, but sometimes they're mutually exclusive. And yet part of what I want to ask us to consider is that even mutually exclusive religious foundations can make it possible for us to build toward one another. They can provide ethical resources that make interreligious peace building possible. And so even when we don't start with common ground, we can construct common ground. And to cite Eboo Patel again, his most recent book is called, what's it called? We Need to Build, I think is what it's called. And what he says, and this is a quote from his book, is he says, social change and healthy institutions don't just fall from the sky, and they don't just rise naturally from the ground. Healthy institutions and social change and collaboration is something that people build. We need to build these things. And we often build these collaborations toward one another and with one another from different places. And so I use that metaphor of a bridge to try to imagine interreligious peace building in that way. I may come back to this in the question and answer time. I want to move on to my last point, which is a historical example. But let me just add one other thing about the bridge. Even though we can exist on different theological or religious shores that sometimes are incompatible with one another, part of what makes this whole idea of interreligious peace building work is that all religions do tap into some common ethical foundation. And so even though we may have, and I'm going to illustrate this with a historical example here in just a second, which is what I'm going to conclude with, but even though we may have very different theological worldviews, mutually exclusive belief systems and practices, that kind of undergirding all of that is an ethic that seems to be universal across different religions. And this won't surprise you. A lot of people have highlighted this, but it's an ethic that can be described as the golden rule. And so people like Karen Armstrong and other scholars like that have highlighted how some kind of ethical instruction or ethical foundation that is found across different religions. And so you have the Jewish notion, for example, of chesed, steadfast love, and the Muslim call to talif, mutual love, throughout the Quran, the Christian imperative of agape, unconditional love, the Buddhist ideal of karuna, compassion, the Jain commitments to ahimsa, nonviolence, the Bantu African indigenous notion of Ubuntu or human intersubjectivity, and all these different things. I would even say that you have secular and humanist forms of this ethic. That while all these ethical ideals are not equivalent with one another, there is enough overlap that it makes separate opposite religious shores connectable. That the ethics here becomes kind of the active ingredient. So part of what I'm doing with my bridge metaphor is I'm saying that religious doctrine and practice can be even mutually exclusive and yet still find overlap in the ethics of the Golden Rule. So you may detect that what I'm trying to do is I'm wrestling with how to handle both religious differences and religious similarities in a coherent theory here. So anyway, let me close with one historical example. And I give a lot of historical examples, contemporary examples, and examples from history, but let me just give one here that I think is especially powerful. And it is the example of the abolition of the African slave trade. And so for those of you that know the history, and we all know this history to some extent, but to put it into a little bit more perspective, in 1807, the British Parliament banned the African slave trade. And up to that point, of course, the African slave trade was the largest forced migration in human history. Injustices and sufferings on a massive scale. And by the way, in the history of the African slave trade, as we know, that whole industry was perpetrated oftentimes by Christians and often supported by Christians quoting their scriptures. And so the African slave trade also shows what religion is capable of at its worst. And yet, in 1807, the African slave trade was finally banned in the British Parliament. It took a couple more decades for slavery itself to be banned. And of course, in North America, it took even longer in a civil war. But it was started to be addressed. And in the British Parliament, it's a very long story for what eventually led to the abolition of the African slave trade. But it involves years of grassroots activism by women and men, many of whom we don't even know their names anymore, many of whom escaped slavery themselves. It's a story and a struggle that continues, as we all know. And yet at that time, in the early 1800s, the grassroots work eventually bubbled up from the bottom up, grassroots asset-based approach here. It bubbled up to the point that it made legislative changes in the parliament. And that is a significant story by itself, but I also want to highlight two key players in bringing about that legislative change. One is William Wilberforce, and Christians often cite William Wilberforce as a major person that helped bring about the legislative changes having to do with slavery. He was a member of the British Parliament. He was an evangelical Christian. He was opposed to slavery because he thought it was evil. He thought it was a sin to enslave other human beings who are made in the image of God through his Christian worldview. He believed that the neighbor love of Jesus made slavery a sin. And so he opposed it and worked very hard to oppose it. But one of his partners in that effort was a man named Jeremy Bentham. And this is a story that especially people in Christian circles often don't tell or maybe don't know about. But Jeremy Bentham was a very influential atheist in the 1800s, a very staunch critic of religion. In fact, he considered religion just to be full of outdated superstitions that holds back human progress. And so, and Jeremy Bentham, if you know anything about him, he was the philosophical father of utilitarianism, this secular approach to morality that's determined by calculating the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It is a secular approach. It is a secular approach to morality that has been very, very influential. But according to Jeremy Bentham, slavery failed the utilitarian calculus because slavery failed in his secular ethic of leading to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, what I want to point out here is that you have two people who, by the way, who developed a great amount of respect for one another. Jeremy Bentham and William Wilberforce knew each other. They respected one another. Jeremy Bentham, as staunch a critic as he was of a religion, actually, he actually dedicated one of the early versions of his essays on the poor laws to William Wilberforce, one of his famous essays. And so you have these two people a Christian and an atheist, despite having very little in common with one another in terms of worldview or ethical motivations, they developed respect for one another and they collaborated on some of the biggest social issues of their day, not just the African slave trade, but animal welfare, prison reform, and other things. And so I find that to be a very instructive illustration. Two people that you could claim were not on common ground when it comes to worldview, beliefs, motivations in life, and yet they found a way to build bridges of peace building and collaboration with one another out of respect, and they addressed some of the biggest challenges of their day. I'm trying to imagine and promote what examples like that we might produce in our world today. And if I can just add one hypothetical addition to this, there I have a Christian, an evangelical Christian, and an atheist. Imagine, if you will, a Hindu being a part of that discussion. One of my good friends is a Hindu scholar. He works in Minnesota, but his name is Anant Rambachan, and he considers himself a liberation theologian, a Hindu liberation theologian, and he directly ties into his resources as a Hindu to try to challenge ideas of human enslavement or different. Or he directly challenges the caste system and the caste traditions in India, for example. But he does so by from a worldview that imagines all of life as part of some impersonal cosmic energy field, and that enslaving another human being is doing a disservice to someone that is a part of the same energy field as you are, and that attracts bad karma. And all I want to do by throwing that hypothetical in is to say, can you imagine an evangelical Christian that is opposed to slavery of any form because of the Imago Dei and because of the Jesus ethic, an atheist who's opposed to slavery of any and oppression of any form because of the utilitarian calculus, and a Hindu who's opposed to slavery of any form because of the realities of karma and a cosmic energy field. What you have there is you have people on three different religious, or at least worldview shores, and those shores have incompatibilities. And yet there are ways to build bridges of peace and peace building that are very, very important for our world. My claim in Better Religion is that we need to be able to pursue and to imagine interreligious peace building in such ways, because we live in a world of increasing religious diversity, of different religions overlapping with one another and interacting with one another. And we have to figure out ways to respect one another, understand one another, and build peace to one another while also honoring the dignity of our differences. So I'll just end by saying I hope that some of this makes sense, and I look forward to if there are any questions or discussions about it. I do invite you to read the book and dive in more. But I'll just end by saying this, and this may be an unusual way to end. But in the book, I also say that I'm not very optimistic about the interreligious peace building that I promote. I have a hard time developing optimism about the very things that I'm promoting. And some of that is because I look at the realities of our world, and anyone that, as I do, anyone that looks at religious realities, there are rising levels of religious turmoil, of religious hostility in our world. Some of that is state perpetrated, some of it is culturally influenced. Religion is regularly hijacked by nationalistic interests or imperial interests. There are internal abusive uses of religion for power and manipulation. All these kind of realities that we're aware of, they are rampant, they are pervasive, and they are tragic. And for all those reasons, the very interreligious peace building that I'm so passionate about sometimes feels very Sisyphean. It feels like mission impossible. And yet, what I hope my book does, and what I want to invite you to do in my concluding comments here, is that even though I'm not optimistic, I am deeply hopeful. And I believe that there is a difference between optimism and hope. And that distinction is something that many religious traditions emphasize. Optimism being what we see and what we understand with our human brains and the calculations that we do, and hope being something that draws on more powerful forces of history, that looks for forces that are outside of ourselves, that looks for divine forces, that looks for deep human forces, and these deep movements of human spirit toward empathy and toward love. And that is what gives me hope, despite all the stories and the reports of hostility. And it makes me hopeful for outbreaks of peace, and makes me want to be a part of that. And I hope it will make you want to be a part of that as well. So I'll stop with that. Carrie, I don't know if you want how you want to do this, or if you want to just open it up, or however you want here.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I feel very inspired and hopeful. I'm sure all of you do too. I even appreciate the realism and kind of the feeling that it feels impossible, because I think all of us who are here are committed to this, and we resonate with that. It feels like a little bit daunting. I will say there was a few comments I'll just read. Minek is here, and he's Zoroastrianism, and so he wants to throw that out there too. And we love that you're here. He really likes, he thinks it's a very good point what you said about facing our differences, and we have in common the original words of the founders of religions, and what we have different are the interpretation of their words, as well as language, culture, tradition. Thank you for sharing that. He also says officials of places of worship and religion have vested interest in keeping the status quo, as also politicians. Do you have a comment on that?
I resonate with it. I appreciate the way that was stated, and I think that's right. I mean, I do think religious institutions often have kind of built-in protective instincts that can protect the status quo, and can often create kind of lines or barriers, or even lines of hostility. That is a risk, and that is a danger. And I sense from the comments also that a shared hope that despite some of those tendencies, religions, even within religious institutions, have these capacities for disrupting injustices and for disrupting the status quo when needed. And so, yeah, we live in those tensions, and I appreciate that comment a lot.
Yeah. And then it looks like Soraya, she just points out that she shared a website, and I've shared it with everyone, that Wilberforce is still defending freedom. There's a website you can go to continue to work towards challenging oppression and standing for those who are persecuted. So thank you for sharing that resource. Does anyone have a question or a comment that they would like to share? Go ahead and unmute yourself. I would love to open it up to anyone who has something to share.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm Kaylee. I don't have my camera on right now because my computer's acting weird. But I was wondering if you have any tips for navigating like difficult conversations in interfaith, where maybe some of the differences are things that maybe some faiths they view as like in a very negative light. So like something that may be banned in their text, but somebody else practices it, or things like that. Do you have any tips or ideas for how to address those conversations?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So I think, what you're bringing up is part of what makes interreligious peace building messy and difficult. And and that we all, those of us that care about and work in it, struggle with these kind of things. I think my best answer to that, honestly, at least a short answer, would be that I'm not. I think ultimately interreligious relationships and kind of grassroots interreligious collaborations that I emphasize have to draw on levels of trust, and trust ultimately comes from friendship. And so I think what I would offer is more than some like formula, like or here are the 3 tips for how to talk about these hard things in that conversation or whatever. I tend to emphasize how can we build spaces? In fact, the Interfaith Center, one of the things I'm remembering from your website too is that the creating those safe spaces for people to interact with one another. I appreciate that, because what those safe spaces do is it allows us to build relationships with one another, to see the humanity in one another, to interact and to understand whether we agree or not. And as we build more of those, just kind of the building blocks of simple friendship, then we'll get to a point where those harder conversations become more manageable and become more possible and become more constructive, frankly. And so, like some of the interfaith, like I'm good friends with. There's 2 women here in the Los Angeles area that do a Muslim Christian peace building initiative, and it's called Two Faiths, One Friendship. And you can look up their Two Faiths, One Friendship website. You can look it up. But one of the things they do is they start by creating spaces where people can interact, get to know each other, build friendships first, and really have a whole curriculum built on that. And then as you move through those steps of building friendships and building trust, then you get to a point where you can collaborate with one another on some shared interests. You can talk to one another about what you have in common and what you have different from one another. And you can slowly build yourself toward an ability to discuss some of the more difficult things. And, the idea there isn't that we talk about hard things so that we can iron it all out, because that likely won't happen. At least it won't happen all the way, through and through. But it's built, at least for me, it's built on a conviction that the deepest and best human relationships are the kind that acknowledge and build respect across differences. And that when I want to be in relationship with someone, I don't want to check at the door some of the things that are most important to me, or some of the things that identify me or that shape my identity most closely. I want to bring those things into a relationship. But if by bringing those things in, if it creates tensions, then that's something we need to work on. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying, I think more than 1 or 2 pieces of advice, I would encourage us to think about ways that we can build simple friendships, and friendships that deepen over time. And then those things kind of come on the tail end.
Awesome. And that also helps with like focusing on the positive aspects of it, because like, for example, we have an event next week. It's on witchcraft and Catholicism. So these 2 speakers, they practice Catholicism, but they also do witchcraft because they incorporate elements of their ancestral practices.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I know people are probably going to see that and be like, wow, like, how does that even work?
Yeah.
So I was just curious because, like in interfaith, you have to be able to navigate those hard conversations. But I think looking forward, we could probably try to do some friendship events or things like that. And I'll definitely have to look into the organization you mentioned as well. What was it called again? The 2 Muslim and Christian?
Two Faiths, One Friendship.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm you have me really interested in that event as well. I would love to. I may look into that. I think that's really interesting. I do think it sounds like those kind of relationships are formed through friendship. One of the things that Ibu Patel, I've mentioned him several times, Interfaith America, kind of started with this conviction that if we're going to get anywhere in interfaith peace, it can't just start with talking heads on panels, religious leaders that get together and kind of share the different details from their religions. It's got to start from ordinary people interacting with one another and getting to know one another and building relationships and collaborating on things, and then that kind of builds from there. And it sounds like that you're thinking in those directions as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
May I ask a quick question, Soraya here? May I go next?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I live in Los Angeles and I'm very familiar with Pepperdine. In fact, I go there very often because my friend's daughter attends Pepperdine.
Oh,
And in the Muslim community in Los Angeles, particularly, we have this notion, oh, Pepperdine, it's a Christian school, you know? And then we draw a blanket. And I'm so glad and heartened to hear you come talk this way, Dr. Barton. It gives us a lot of hope. I founded the largest interfaith solidarity network with my Jewish friend in Los Angeles. I was heading that for a while, but because of my travels, I don't do that much work with the organization, but I'm highly invested in international religious freedom. When we talk very deeply into the violations that happen in the name of religion. So that's a lot of advocacy work that happens, and that's to be shared maybe another time. But what I want to tell you is that I can't agree with you more than when you said it's a grassroots effort. And I think such an effort can begin at Pepperdine because we have young and hopeful graduates there. So just a comment.
yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment, and I would love to. I mean, if you're out here, I'd love for us to connect. I do have, in fact, and some of the young, hopeful Pepperdine students and graduates that you mentioned, I see 3 or 4 of them on this call. People that have been in my class and that have gone into Muslim and Baha'i and Buddhist and Hindu and Jewish settings with me as part of our class, trying to interact and learn more about each other. But I really appreciate that and would love to connect with you personally and learn more about your work.
I would love to travel and, to look at Malibu, the beach, and also a
Yeah, we
bonus
have
would
that
be
too.
to-
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I would love to do that. I'll take you on that any day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions or final comments? We have a few more minutes.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Becky. You go first.
Well, I come from Pittsburgh, and I belong to the Thomas Merton Center, and we did a lot of social action around peace, and we had a lot of anarchists along with us sometimes, which caused a lot of conflict. And we tried to build that bridge, but I don't think we did such a good job, because they would always show up and they would always do this like damage to property and, kind of ruin the effort,
Yeah.
because the concentration was always on what they were doing, not on the purpose of the group marching for instance, against the Iraq war or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not very, well, I almost would say I'm not very hopeful sometimes either. Not only not optimistic, but sometimes I don't know how to handle such a situation. That's.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. I really do, and it's certainly true. And I think Carrie mentioned this as well. I really do try to stay on the realistic side of these things, but even hope is hard to come by sometimes. And there are forces out there that frustrate the best of efforts. And I think that's part of the reality of it. And I appreciate you sharing that and making and bringing that out just honestly. at the end of the day, I don't know what else to do. I mean, from the Christian scriptures, from my traditions, there's a quote in the book of Romans where the Apostle Paul says, "Just live at peace with everyone as far as it depends on you." And at the end of the day, I don't know what else to do except to hold on to hope as a form of resistance against despair, resistance against anarchy, to hold on to it the best I can, and to look for collaborators, whether in my traditions or in other traditions, that want to hold on to it with me, and then do the best we can. And knowing that there will be those challenges and those frustrations along the way. But I really appreciate you mentioning that. And I wish you peace and hope.
Thank you.
And Claudia has a question, looks like.
Well, I don't really have a question. I just have a comment, and I appreciate your presentation very much. I tried to take notes, and I know it'll be recorded, but thank you. It's really an excellent program that you're sharing with people. I was Christian growing up, but I'm Baha'i. Oh. Practicing Baha'i. And so I have to be really fragmented in my comments because of a lack of time. I don't want to dominate, but in the Baha'i faith, we're working across the globe collaboratively with anyone and everyone in not only community building, but society building efforts. And on the community level, it could be something as simple as working toward making the streets safer in a community, or maybe enhancing children's education with regards to spiritual teachings, morality, morals, virtues, so forth, things of that nature. There are many different efforts. And so I also believe, as a Baha'i, in one God and the unity of God, and that every human being in this planet is part of one family. We're part of one human family, and there's a lot of diversity there, but we really all, I believe, have the same thing at heart, and that is peace and unity and so much more. And so I could go on about that, but I can't because of time. But I could mention one other group. There's an organization in the Cincinnati area called Equations, and they have a couple of different events. This group is 80. They form about 80 different faiths and faith-based organizations, and annually they have a festival of faiths where they come together in Cincinnati in August and present different programs and share share our common goals for humanity. And throughout the year, then we have an additional program under that umbrella of Equations, where it's called Sacred Connections. And each month, a different faith opens up their house of worship and invites people in from other faiths to come in and learn about their faith and talk about them and share our experiences. Because, histories differ, cultures differ, laws during the times when the prophets came, they brought different messages, but the spiritual truths are all the same that they brought, not just the golden rule. There's so many other pearls that are shared commonly among the faiths, like covenant and detachment. I'm just reading off a list of things that.
Hey, Claudia, let's go ahead.
Is that too much?
Yeah, we only have 2 minutes left. I'm sorry. I think we had a student who had a question. I just want to.
We have a lot in common, a lot.
Yeah.
So that's all I'll say. Sorry.
Let me just say thank you, Claudia. I appreciate that very much. And I do have a lot of interactions with Baha'i communities, and even one of my Baha'i students is on this call right now. So I appreciate that very, very much. Thank you.
I'm sorry it was so fragmented and long.
I'm sorry we don't have more time. If you want to put any links in the chat, we'll share that. And was there a student who had a comment or a question?
I think he left. I think he had to leave. Yeah.
Okay. And I know, Manek, you have a question, and we only have 1 minute left. So would you be able to ask a question or make a comment within 1 minute? And then we need to wrap it up. Manak, do you hear me?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, did you have a
Okay.
comment?
Yeah,
or-
basically, no, I just had a quick comment that, I'm a president of the Greater Huntington Beach Interfaith Council in California. And we have several programs during the year where the public is invited, and that gives an opportunity for people to mingle with different faiths, and talk to each other about things like that. Also that even in interfaith, sometimes we see a little bit of a hierarchy understanding, so the established Abrahamic faiths, they tend to marginalize a little bit, indirectly, not very directly, some of the non-Abrahamic faiths, like Hinduism or Zoroastrianism or something. And so there's a lot, we have a lot of challenges we have to kind of change our own individual preconceptions and attitudes in order to promote real interfaith dialogue and all that.
Yeah.
So that's all
Yeah.
I have to say. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
Do you have any final comments, Dr. Barton, on that? Maybe some thoughts you want to leave us with?
Not beyond just a statement of gratitude. I appreciate being a part of a conversation with people that care about these things, and certainly we're talking about them because they're important and because they're difficult. So I would just say thank you, and as I said to one of the speakers a minute ago, just I extend and wish blessings and peace to all of you.
And we do have a few just thank yous in the chat box and asking how they can reach you. Are they able to find your email on Pepperdine's website?
Yeah, so John.Barton at Pepperdine. So it's just my name, JOHN.BARTON at pepperdine.edu. I'd be glad to interact with anyone.
Yay. And I would like to encourage everyone to check out his book, Better Religion, a primer for interreligious peacebuilding. I do also want to do a shout out. Anne Farrow is on the call, and she is our executive director of the Oxford Citizens for Peace and Justice. So she's really committed to doing grassroots peace work here in our community. So thank you for being here and just reminding us of how important that work is, even though it feels daunting and overwhelming. And please reach out to us or reach out to Anne if you want to get involved in doing that grassroots peace building. That's why we're here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the students for being here. Just your presence is very inspiring. And thank you so much for what you do to do grassroots peace building in our community. So do you have a thought you want to leave us with, Anne?
Thanks for the shout out. This has been really useful, and we're located in the Interfaith Center for a reason. I think you can't have peace building without bringing together how people identify in terms of their faith. So I think there's a lot of work we can do together in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, John, I really think this is a catalyst for us here in Oxford to keep coming together and doing this work. Please know that what you're doing in Malibu has reached us and it is not going to end here. The conversation will continue. So thank you for being here. And thank you, Anne, for being here. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And from California, and Claudia, thank you, all of you. So we will continue. Kaylee is our director at the Interfaith Center. You can't see her, but you can hear her voice. She's got programs scheduled coming up to continue bringing us together for social change. So let's change our world together. Let's not lose hope. And Becky, I know she says she's discouraged, but she's been doing this work for years, and she's one of our icons in Oxford. We look to her. So you say you're discouraged, Becky, but you inspire all of us. So thank you all for the work you do. Let's change the world together. Thank you, Dr. Barton. We will read your book, and we will continue to be inspired by your great work. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you all.